About a year and a half ago, jihadis opened fire and detonated explosive vests at an Eagles of Death metal concert in Paris, killing 89 people and seriously injuring many more. Yesterday, on the 4-year anniversary of the murder of British soldier Lee Rigby by 2 converts to Islam, a Muslim suicide bomber named Salman Abedi attacked a bunch of teenage girls at an Ariana Grande concert in Manchester.
And despite all these suicide bombers, our religion does not allow suicide. قاتلوا نفسه في النار. If you kill yourself, you're in hell.
But what we see in the patterns of suicide terrorism since 1980 is that suicide terrorists are overwhelmingly walk-in volunteers who are not longtime members of the organization, and they're joining typically just a few months or even just a few weeks to do their actual suicide attack, and their core motive, there's some variation, but their core motive is to cause combat forces that are sitting right now on the territory to leave that territory. And so absent that situation, we rarely see terrorist leaders able to mobilize support for their plans.
So you're saying the reason is not in and of itself then fundamental Islam, because there's a political goal to it. Isn't that part of your argument?
Exactly right. Yeah.
Generally about terrorism, okay, and we know from the statistics that overwhelmingly people who are suicide bombers are Muslims, and we look at the attacks recently and there is a common thread running through it that is Islamic. A lot of people will deny that, but that's just what the facts say.
After a soccer match earlier this weekend in Turkey, a twin suicide bombing took the lives of 38 people and injured more than 160 others. Officials believe the bombing was the work of the Kurdish terrorist group TAK, an offshoot of the PKK. This is the 19th terrorist incident in Turkey in 2016. In 2015 alone, suicide attacks around the world reportedly killed or injured more than 9,000 civilians. Most suicide bombings target Muslims rather than non-Muslims. Yet, there's this widespread perception in the West that suicide bombings tend to be carried out by Muslims against non-Muslim targets and serve this religious purpose rooted deep within Islamic doctrine. Suicide bombings have been around since the 18th century.
The most comprehensive statistics that were done, as I've mentioned before in the corner, were conducted by someone called Robert Pape in a book called Dying to Win, where he done a statistical research from 1980 to 2005, where he concluded that the people who did the most suicide bombing, he actually found that there are 315 suicide bombs that happened in that period of time. And the number one
Sorry, can you tell me the time period again?
It's 315. He said that his name is Robert, between 1980 and 2005. Yeah, this was the most comprehensive study that was done by a sociologist in the field, and probably Robert Pape and his book Dying to Win in the academic spheres, and I know that because I've done research on this personally in universities, is one of the most respected, one of the most respected works. So from that angle, there's about 315 suicide bombs that were done internationally, according to this man, and the majority of them were done by the Tamil Tigers, which are not Muslims. Now, the reason why someone like yourself, Lizzie, is very, very angry and continually asking about why Muslims continually...
It's me asking.
Yeah, many people, right. It's because of the media exposure, right? Now, I'm putting forward that according to, if we look at the raw data, there is a disproportionate amount of people that are basically committing suicide attacks that are non-Muslim, that are not being reported whatsoever.
And then the myth of religious violence. Like, well, what is that? This myth of religious violence. Muslims, this is the most violent religious period in the history of Islam, probably. If you look at the historian who did the body count study, which is online, proved that the single most violent civilization in human history is the secular humanistic civilization. It's killed more people than any other civilization. The second is Christianity, just by looking at historical numbers. Out of the 7 civilizations studied, Islam was the 6th, number 6. The only less violent civilization than the Muslim civilization was the Hindu civilization. Amazing. Muslims are accused of being violent everywhere. The Ottomans, the Ottoman civilization was the most multicultural civilization in human history, and in many ways surpassed modern multiculturalism because they allowed communities, minority communities, to be completely independent. They had their own court systems. They could judge the people themselves. The Jews had their own court systems in Ottoman countries. In Iraq, they had 3 vilayat. 3. They had the Shia, the Sunni, and the Kurdish vilayat. They didn't force them all to live together. They let them live in their own environment, just like they're asking now for independence.
How about the one that is responsible for most of the suicide bombings?
Oh, that is so Islamophobic.
I am Islamophobic.
Yeah. So this idea of, suicide bombings and suicide killings and all that, it's important, again, to understand this in context and understand, where did this start? What is the history behind it, and why do people do it, and where's the connection between Islam? There's always somehow this connection between Islam and suicide bombing. That's what's in the minds of many people, because that's what they consume in mainstream media, unfortunately. Let's take a look at some facts, okay? The first recorded suicide attack that we know of as human beings, as researchers, was actually done by Christian crusaders against Muslims. So there was a group of crusaders who actually sunk their own ship so that they could actually result in 10 times the deaths of Muslims on that the expedition, right? So this is the first incident, right? This is classical. Then you fast forward to the modern era. You find the first modern suicide bombing that's taking place in St. Petersburg, right? In let's see, what's the year I got? 1881, where they killed the Tsar, basically. The guy was not a Muslim. This was not a Muslim suicide bombing, and suicide bombings continued. It continues and it continues with kamikazes. So in war, you got the Japanese, and what they're doing is many Japanese are volunteering themselves to get in airplanes, and they go and they crash, bombs into certain, ships, and to sink those ships. The Germans are practicing the same type of suicide bombing techniques during the battle for Berlin against the Russians. So they're going and they're trying to destroy the bridges that are coming. They're sacrificing their own lives for a military purpose. And then what really happened is there really wasn't much suicide bombing during the Cold War period. That's really interesting. The reason why and this is important for everyone to understand, specifically Joe, is that the reason why there wasn't suicide bombing during the Cold War period is because the superpowers of the US and Russia, Soviet Union, they're equipping these little countries that are fighting with each other, right? They're equipping them with a lot of weapons. When you have a lot of weapons to fight other people back with, you don't need suicide bombing. So then what happened is that we don't see much during the Cold War. The next instance of suicide bombing that we start seeing is in Lebanon. So in Lebanon, when Israel goes and occupies Lebanon in the early 80s, you get a movement of people who cannot fight back against superior military technology that Israel has. So they start getting this idea of, let's go start doing the suicide bombings. What's really interesting, and this is how suicide bombing became prevalent in modern society today. It started in Lebanon particularly, and what's really interesting is 77% of the people who were engaging in suicide bombings in Lebanon, they were communists or socialists. They were not doing it for Islamic reasons. They were not doing it because, they're inspired to do for some Muslim cause or something like that. And what's more interesting is 8% of them were Christian as well, right? So this is not a religious thing. This is a secular thing, meaning in the sense that it's something that people are doing because they have no other military option to carry out anything. And then when people saw that Israel actually backed out of Lebanon, they say, oh, well, it looks like suicide bombing's potentially working, and we don't have any resources to fight back, we should do something along these lines, right? So now somehow, what's going on in the world today is whenever you find a group of people, it doesn't matter if it's the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka who are not religious, this is not a Muslim group, they have nothing to do with Islam at all, they were conducting suicide bombings against the government so that they could get their own Tamil region, right? Why are they doing this? This is a way for people who don't have many resources to fight back for whatever cause they're fighting for. So when you're deciding who's a terrorist and what's a terrorist and who's fighting and who's suicide bombing, the first thing you got to ask yourself is this cause justified, what they're fighting for? Are they freedom fighters or are they terrorists? The second thing is, do they have the ability to fight or they don't have the ability to fight back? If they don't have any weapons, and they're being oppressed or they have no resources whatsoever, then yeah, they might be willing to utilize their bodies. What does all of this have to do with Islam? Absolutely nothing. There is absolutely nothing connected with the religion of Islam that's saying you should go and use yourself as use your body as a way of going and, targeting a specific bomb at an individual, or going and, killing innocent civilians, or all the other things that are somehow connected or tied to suicide bombing. So this idea of, well, Islam is responsible for suicide bombing is just another one of those, just fake, misleading propaganda statements that just keeps being thrown out there.
Terrorism, 9/11 for instance, according to classical Islamic law, is classified as hiraba, which carries the death penalty. Jihad is not the same as a militant perspective. Jihad just means the use of proportional force, which exists in most cultures, just war doctrine. Terrorism is something else. Terrorism is the arbitrary targeting of the innocent in order to place pressure on governments, which is something that doesn't have origins in Islamic culture or ethics and comes out of the French Revolution and certain 19th century anarchist movements that use terrorism. Its adoption in the Muslim world is very recent and is an expression of westernization. But terrorism, 9/11 for instance, according to classical Islamic law, is classified as hiraba, which carries the death penalty. So there isn't really an issue. The problem is people in the West don't know who speaks for Islam, and in most cases they don't even think that they should ask. Islam has leaders and muftis and Islamic universities that issue declarations on these things, but everybody's very vague about what Muslims actually think. So they know about Abu Qatada or whoever, but they don't know what the Mufti of Egypt is saying about anything. It's pretty hopeless, really.
And it kind of takes away the context of what is the political circumstance going on in that specific area, in that country, where we need to analyze, is this struggle just or unjust? Killing of innocent civilians is never just. It's never allowed in Islam. But that's not even, when people say suicide bomb, they're not even talking about that. They have a problem with this idea of suicide and bombing and killing or whatever it is. This is a military thing. It's a political thing. In order for this to take place, there needs to be a political context. That's what needs to be kept in mind.
And who's substantiate academics, they don't bring them on mainstream media because it doesn't support the narrative.
No.
And it would educate the public to the awareness of really what's going on in these areas of the world. That Robert Pape, the terrorist expert, he analyzed over 1,000 different terrorist attacks to date, and he talks about this has little to nothing to do with Islam or religion. A lot of times he said that many of these are secularists, he says, and people are about to do a suicide attack, and now they're going to face death, and all of a sudden they become religious.
Right.
Because that's it. Now people find God at the end.
Right.
And now they cling on to it. But in reality, it's because they want the occupying force out of there, and like you're saying, they have no other means.
Right.
And again, anything to do with Islam now?
Yeah, no, it's all political.
It's political.
It's political.
That's exactly what the terrorist expert, Dr. Robert Pape, an
that's
academic from the University of Chicago,
says.
That's
what every terrorist expert says, that, there's a political, objective that's there. You need to justify that objective. You're gonna justify it either with nationalism, Nazi party, neo-Nazi, whatever it is. You're gonna justify it with some religion that you practice. You're gonna justify it with your superiority of your race. You need to justify the political objective. Some people will use religion to justify it. Some people will use nationalism. Some people will use race. They'll use other factors. If there's no political objective, then there's not going to be any terrorism.
In my opinion, it's injustice, humiliation, oppression that are the most common causes of terrorism.
Some people claim that religion motivates terrorists. However, the academic research of Dr. Robert Pape has proved the claim to be false.
I found myself just almost without thinking about it, collecting the first complete set of all suicide terrorist attacks around the world from 1980 through early 2004.
And how long has suicide terrorism been around?
Oh, actually, for thousands of years, the very first suicide attackers are the Jewish zealots in Zachari in the 1st century A.D. The Jewish zealots were under Roman occupation, and they were trying to foment a rebellion among the Jewish population against their Roman occupiers. Well, what the zealots would do is they would go up to a legion of Roman soldiers, pull out a knife, slit the throat of one of the Roman soldiers, and then the other Roman soldiers would stab or spear that person to death. And those attackers knew that would happen, but they were hoping that they would be able to foment a rebellion or an insurrection with that process. And in fact, that did lead to the Jewish War of 66 AD, which led to the destruction of the Second Temple and the diaspora that had occurred. So those really were
successful.
It was successful in producing the revolt, but not so successful in terms of producing the outcome that they had been hoping for.
Were there, say, theological background for what these early Jews did?
Well, actually, it was quite controversial, much like today, where you have some suicide terrorists doing it for religious purposes, who are actually stretching and changing the mainstream understanding of their religion. Many zealots at the time were not well respected among mainstream Jewish scholars, and in fact, to this day, there's quite a bit of controversy about the appropriateness of the behavior of the zealots, and it just simply remains an extremely controversial episode. Nowhere near, yes, the zealots were claiming that they were partly acting out of religious commitment to end an occupation, but that doesn't mean that mainstream understanding of Judaism accepted their behavior as legitimate.
And so this phenomenon then is clearly not of suicide terrorism. It's not limited to fundamentalist Islam.
That's exactly right, and that's one of the big things that jumped out of my study. You see, when I collected that database of the suicide attackers from 1980 to early 2004, I ended up studying 462 suicide terrorists who actually killed themselves. And the first thing that jumped right out at me is that over half are secular. The world leader in suicide terrorism is the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. They're a Marxist group, a secular group, a Hindu group. Over a third of the Muslim suicide terrorist attacks are by secular groups such as the PKK, which is a Kurdish terrorist organization in Turkey, which is also Marxist, that is anti-religion in orientation. And so it's really quite misleading to believe that suicide terrorism is mainly a product of religion or specifically Islamic fundamentalism. That just hasn't been the case.
Of course, it depends what you mean by religion, doesn't it? Because a belief in a kind of ideology, whether it be officially religious or whether it be Marxist, could still take the same form of some action that you perceive somehow is going to have some transformative effect in the world.
You're quite right that an ideology, if it were able to produce suicide terrorism independent of specific circumstances, could take the form of a religion. But in fact, what over 95% of all suicide terrorist attacks around the world have in common is not a type of religion or ideology, but a specific strategic goal: to compel modern democracies to withdraw combat forces from territory the terrorists view as their homeland or prize greatly. From Lebanon to Sri Lanka to Chechnya to Kashmir to the West Bank, every suicide terrorist campaign since 1980 has had as its central objective to compel a democratic state to withdraw combat forces. I don't mean advisors with sidearms. I mean tanks, fighter aircraft, armored personnel vehicles from territory that the terrorists prize. Yes, many are religious, many are secular, many are communists or socialists who are pursuing, if you would, a secular religion. But outside of that circumstance of the presence of foreign combat forces on territory the terrorists prize, we rarely see suicide terrorism occurring.
So you look at Israel then, in a sense, in precisely this way.
In precisely in this way. In fact, suicide terrorism against Israel from the West Bank and from Gaza really begins to take off in the 1990s. And the key thing that's useful for people to know is that Israel occupied those territories starting in 1967, but didn't actually begin to settle the territories with large numbers of Jewish settlers until the 1980s. Today, there are over 400,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank. In fact, 200,000 near East Jerusalem and another 200,000 outside of the area of Jerusalem in the West Bank. Well, they really didn't begin to come until the 1980s. As late as 1982, there were only 12,000. And what really began to happen from the mid-1980s on is large numbers of Jewish settlers began to settle in the West Bank, and that began to provoke. It began to provoke first ordinary violence in Intifada with throwing rocks and stones, and then guerrilla war, and then suicide terrorism as an effort to try to end that increasing occupation.
Now, you teach at the University of Chicago, which is sort of famed for its interdisciplinary, I don't know whether it's still the case, the Committee for Social Thought and so on. So have you talked about your theory, say, with people in religious studies?
Yeah, absolutely.
And did you gain anything from that conversation? Because you're saying somehow there's something about people being on your land, in your territory, Western democracies, or somebody that you feel that shouldn't be there, that somehow inspires this.
And in fact, I learned quite a bit from the great scholars we have at our divinity school, because as I began to make these arguments, I of course didn't know much about the history of martyrdom as it's, say, Christian martyrdom or Jewish martyrdom, and I'm learning about this as I'm doing the basic research. Well, they're telling me, often pointing me and guiding me to the literature, which shows that in fact there's a fair bit of similarity in the early martyrs that we note in our own religion, where in the case of both the Jewish martyrs, the Zealots and Zachari, and then the early Christian martyrs, we have cases where they're often acting in opposition to, in both of those cases, Roman occupation. And in fact, in the 2nd and 3rd century, where the Christian martyrs are becoming so prominent, that's really the heyday, if you would, of the large number of Christian martyrs. Many of them are martyring themselves, killing themselves deliberately, as an act of defiance against Rome.
But it certainly feeds into, very strongly into, religious ideology. I mean, give us a sense of the mind of one of these terrorists who's recruited. Give me a sense of what's going on in that person's mind, and how the terrorist organizations recruit these people?
We see three individual patterns in the individual motivations of suicide terrorists. Some are clearly interested in social prestige, which is why they make martyr videos or do it with friends, do it as part of friendship groups. The Hebron soccer team, for instance, 4 of the members of the Hebron soccer team conducted suicide terrorist attacks on the West Bank in the Second Intifada just 2 years ago. The second pattern we see is the desire for personal revenge against combat forces that have killed either close family members or close friends of the individual. And last November, you might remember that the woman, there were suicide attacks in Jordan. Well, one suicide attacker, her bomb didn't go off, and it was a woman who gave some very poignant interviews afterwards explaining that she had lost 3 brothers in Fallujah in Iraq. She was an Iraqi. She lost 3 brothers in Fallujah during the American assault on Fallujah, and in fact, she was interested in some revenge. And she seemed to show no remorse whatsoever. The third pattern we see are religious. There are religious suicide attackers. I don't mean to deny that, but what cuts across all 3 of those patterns is deep anger at the presence of foreign combat forces that on territory the terrorists prize, and absent that common motive, we rarely see those other individual patterns producing suicide terrorism on their own.
Right.
I had a guy say to me, hey, would you rather have a country run by Buddhists have a nuclear weapon or a country run by Muslims have a nuclear weapon? I go, I don't know. I wouldn't want to have a country run by Christians have a nuclear weapon because they're the only ones who fucking dropped one. We dropped 2 of them, by the way, and we didn't need to. But if you asked MacArthur and Eisenhower, they said we didn't even need to drop the first nuclear bomb on Japan, and we did it anyway. Japan was looking for a way to surrender. So, again, trying to make out that there's another religion that's even worse than there's nothing worse than the Crusades. There's nothing worse than dropping nuclear bombs. There's nothing worse than invading Iraq. George Bush said they said, did you ask your father for advice on your Iraq invasion? And he said, I asked my heavenly father. And then he called it a crusade. So here we are, a Christian guy invading another Muslim country, killing hundreds of thousands of people, ordering torture and war crimes to cover it up. But because here's the big difference. Terrorism is the violence of the weak, and we condemn it. War is the violence of the strong, and we glorify it, which is why when I go to the Rose Bowl, I have to watch a fucking B-1 bomber fly over, and everybody salute and cheer it. A fucking weapon of death. Everyone, yeah! Okay, it's because would you cheer a jihadist with a pipe bomb or a suicide bomber? Because that's their war. Terrorism is the war of the weak. And a conventional war is the war of the strong. And that's all. So don't quit pretending we're different. We're not. We kill way more people. We've killed way more people.